This was when I was 20 years old before I started college. It was the fall of 1992, and at the time, I was working in the material preparation department of a plastics factory. I was working the night shift and was the only female in the department. My male co-workers were initially skeptical that I could handle the job, but I proved to them what I was made of and earned their respect. It was hard work, but on the plus side, it also put me in the best shape of my life. It was also around this time that I put an end to the most toxic relationship I have ever been in my life. My now ex-boyfriend was verbally, emotionally, and physically abusive, as well as an alcoholic. This fact, more than anything else, was probably the reason I got into this situation in the first place. I had just left work and it was around 1:30 a.m. My car was carbureted and consumed a lot of fuel, so the tank was emptying in no time, so I stopped at a local gas station to fill up. While I was pumping gas, a woman about my age came up to me looking nervous and scared. She said she had been at her boyfriend's house and they had gotten into a fight, and she walked to the gas station to use the payphone to call a friend to pick her up on the way to the station. A car pulled up as she was walking and the guys inside started calling out to her and harassing her with a slight nod of their heads. She pointed to a car that was parked off to the side next to the gas station trash cans. This was a large light green car, like a Cadillac or Lincoln, with at least 2 or 3 men inside. She operates what it looked like from my angle. She said they threatened her and she was too scared to call her friend and wait. The woman was clean, well-dressed, and didn't look drugged or drunk or anything. What she did look like was very nervous and scared, so I didn't even hesitate. I finished gassing up and told her to get in my car and I would drive her home. At that hour on a weekday night, there was little traffic, so I immediately pulled out of the gas station and asked her where she lived. While we were on the road, she kept turning in the seat to see if the car was behind us, and when I asked her to put on her seatbelt, she ignored me and kept looking for the car. I assumed she was just scared. A few blocks ahead, however, I noticed that she was looking around the car and started asking me about money. "Where's your purse? Where's your purse? I need money. You need to give me some money." My stomach flipped. I had this woman in my car and now she was going to rob me. But when I thought about it, robbery didn't make much sense. I was driving a 1985 Chevrolet and wearing my work clothes, a tattered t-shirt and jeans with combat boots. She didn't look like a person with a lot of cash, mainly because she was indeed not a person with a lot of cash. She spun around the seat again and started yelling, "There they are, there they are." But she no longer looked scared. I checked the rear view and sure enough, the light green car was right behind me. Then she started laughing and jumping in the seat, giggling like crazy, opening the glove compartment, reaching in the back for a purse, telling me all the horrible things the guys were planning to do to me. Hearing this made me panic, and I realized what a terrible mistake I had made. If I had been smart, I would have driven to the police station. In fact, if I had been really smart, I would have called the police from the gas station and waited with them until they arrived. Unfortunately, none of this crossed my mind until now. At the time, I felt equal parts angry and scared, but I also realized 3 key things all of a sudden. There was an intersection up ahead with cars on both sides waiting to cross, and the light had just turned yellow. I had a spare box cutter I kept for work in the driver's side door compartment, and the crazy lady in the passenger seat hadn't put her seatbelt on yet. I didn't even think about it. I just hit the gas pedal to the metal and went under the yellow light just as it turned red. I looked back to see if the green car was still behind me, but the cross traffic at the intersection had just started moving and they were stuck. At that point, she started yelling insults at me and telling me to slow down, while clinging to the seat with her fingernails. She didn't seem so amused anymore, but I was very wrong if I thought she could trick me, steal from me and leave me at the mercy of her minions to do all the horrible things she said they would do to me once they caught up with me. At which point I gave a scream and accelerated the car to the best of my ability. She started screaming in panic, and that's when I slammed on the brakes and she shot out of the seat and hit the dashboard and windshield with great force, making a solid and brutally satisfying crunch as she bounced off the passenger seat. At that instant, I unbuckled my seatbelt, pulled the box cutter out of the door compartment and put it right in her face and started screaming hysterically at her to get the hell out of my car, or I would cut her face off and make her eat the pieces. I can't remember exactly what I said, but it was a combo of crazy screaming and while holding the cutter just millimeters from her face. Now she was the one panicking, so even as visibly sore as she was after the hard hit she took against the dashboard and windshield, she blindly grabbed the handle and opened the door, but she was having a hard time getting out, so I started pushing and hitting her until I pulled her out of the door and set her down on the sidewalk. Knowing the guys were close, I stepped on the gas again, got to the next corner and made the tires squeal with the passenger door still open. I made a few more turns because I was afraid the green car would catch up with me, and only after a while I stopped to close the passenger door. Then I crossed town and took the freeway home. I was on the freeway for about 10 minutes before I started to feel shaky. I pulled over to the shoulder to try to calm down and then drove quickly home. I told my sister, with whom I was living temporarily after the breakup with my ex, about everything that had just happened. She wrapped me in a tight bear hug while simultaneously yelling at me, berating me about how stupid I was for not going to the police, but the truth is, I have never been so happy to be yelled at in my life. In the summer of 2008, I got a job at a tech company called IP Data One. The company no longer exists, and I honestly don't know how they were able to maintain the business for several years, as it really turned out to be a pyramid scheme. But fortunately, I was working in the typical tech support call center, so I was not directly involved with the scam, as I never sold anything. I was just providing technical advice. When I had been working at the company for about 2 months, I decided to take the 10-hour night shifts. So I worked Wednesday through Saturday from 1 p.m. to 12 a.m., with 1 hour for lunch, and after 6 p.m., I was completely alone in the entire building. The rush to get out of the office at 6 p.m. was crazy. I couldn't blame them, but I decided that having 3 days off was better than 2. As I said, I was alone most of the night, and during that time, I had to keep an eye on emails and make sure I answered all the calls, which weren't many at that hour. It was a very slow shift, so most of my hours were spent playing video games, reading and doing schoolwork and writing. But sometimes I would just wander the halls of the building alone to get away from my desk for a while. I had the voice phone system hooked up to my cell phone so I wouldn't miss any calls. This allowed me to go get a soda, enjoy a snack, or do anything away from my desk, so I had a certain kind of freedom. If I wanted to go get a soda or something, I had to go to the vending machine that was in the basement. The basement had a wall of windows and a set of security doors. The same for the main entrance, only there was a camera in front of that door, but nothing else to really make you feel very safe. I didn't really like going to the basement because the back of the building overlooked a wooded area that at night was really dark and kind of spooky. There was a walking path into the woods, but for some reason they didn't install lights for the path. I never really knew for what reason they didn't. But the truth is that this contributed to making the place look really creepy. Sometimes I would see animals passing by, but other times I really felt like someone was watching me. It was a very unsettling feeling, so whenever I went there, I would do my best to do what I was going to do very quickly. When I would get a soda or a snack, I would do it in a hurry, just to get out of there quickly. One night I was heading to the basement of the building to get a soda as usual. It was an exceptionally slow night and I needed a little caffeine to keep me awake. I counted my money as I walked, to make sure I had enough to get in and out quickly. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw some sort of small object being thrown from the glass door back into the darkness. I stopped dead in my tracks and tried to scan the forest with my eyes, but as I said, it was just blackness. I felt a little uneasy, and now everything was telling me to turn around and go back to my desk. But it was 9 p.m., and I had plenty of time left in my shift, and I needed to stay awake. So I decided to ignore the strange feeling and walked quickly to the vending machine. I made my selection and the soda dropped. As I bent down to grab it, I heard a loud ping noise. It was as if someone had hit the glass with something. I stood up and felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I turned around slowly and was afraid I might see someone out there. But when I turned all the way around, I once again saw nothing but darkness heading into the woods. I thought it was a good time to grab my refreshment and run back to the main floor. I was so urgent to get out of that place, I didn't bother to take the elevator, so I went for the stairs and ran down them. My heart was already racing from having to go down there in the first place, but it flat out almost stopped after I heard a loud bang coming from the basement. Feeling my whole body panic, I ran up the stairs, jumping 2 flights of stairs at once. Returning to my desk after what felt like climbing Everest, I sank into my chair and tried to calm down. It was just a noise. I was in a building with closed doors and locked inner offices. I kept saying over and over in my head, trying desperately to convince myself that it was nothing. There was no longer any noise, and I was a little relieved about that. But out of nowhere, I had that feeling again that someone was watching me. I peeked over the wall of my cubicle and looked around my office. Nothing seemed out of place until I turned to look toward the front of the building, outside the first set of doors. Then my heart stopped when I saw a thin, tall, very dirty man standing there. The guy was cupping his hands around his eyes to try to see past the reflection of the lights inside. Before he could see me, I quickly ducked down and dropped into my cubicle. He didn't look like anyone I had seen in the office, and it was a little after 9 p.m. There was no reason for this person to be checking out my office. As I sat back in my chair, I heard the door shake. I slowly stood up and watched him pull the door handles hard, but to my relief, they didn't budge. But as I watched him trying not to be seen, he turned and fixed his eyes on me. His face looked bruised and dirty. I couldn't make out his features very clearly, but once his eyes locked onto mine, he started pulling the door much harder and banging on the glass. I was so scared I can't even describe it in words. It was the middle of the night. I was alone and in the middle of this empty office building complex. Few times in life have I ever felt so desperate and helpless. Feeling my heart in my throat, I did the only thing I could think of at the time. I grabbed my headset and dialed 911. As I put the operator on the line, the guy paced back and forth through the glass doors. Meanwhile, a lady's voice finally answered and quickly asked me what my emergency was. Yes, my name is Sarah, and I work in the IPDA 1 service building. There is a guy trying to break into my office building. As I was talking to her, the guy disappeared from my sight in an instant. I tried to look in all directions, but I didn't see him. I knew he wouldn't just go away, not with how hard he was pounding. Out of nowhere, a huge boulder shot out from somewhere and slammed into the door. I screamed at the top of my lungs and scrambled under my desk. The operator asked what had just happened, and I explained in a shaky, desperate voice that a rock smashed into the glass door. She asked me if the glass was broken enough to let it in. I didn't want to get up and look, but she told me to do it, so she knew where I was now. I crawled out from under my desk and just peeked over my wall. That's when I saw a huge crack in the first part of the door. At that moment, my heart sank, and I told the operator to please have the police rush over. She said they were on their way, but this did not reassure me one bit. I've heard hundreds of stories like this before where people say the cops never get there fast enough, and the truth is I completely agree, because that wait feels like time stands still and you can't do anything. I was in a state of absolute dread, hiding under my desk, when another knock against the door startled me again. But more frightening was the sound of glass shattering and flying all over the floor. I began to cry desperately, feeling that I had no escape. The man had broken the glass and there was nothing between me and him. I began to hear the sound of boots stomping across the floor and crunching as they stepped on the broken glass. But suddenly, other sounds broke through the silence of the night. These were the police sirens approaching my building. Music to my ears. At that moment, I was still on the line, so I told the operator in my hopeful voice that the police had finally arrived and thanked her for all her support. At the same instant that the sound of sirens flooded the building, I felt the footsteps stop dead in their tracks, being only about 3 or 4 meters away from me, and then I heard them running at full speed out of the building again. I stood up and looked over the cubicle wall. The red and blue lights were flashing wildly, but what I didn't see was the man. The top of the door was completely shattered and the rock lay inside the entrance. One officer came to the front door, and others were outside combing the area. I could see their flashlights moving all over the parking lot. The first officer who entered the building and greeted me was a very nice man, and he was also patient with me and let me explain everything that happened, although I was stuttering from the nerves that were still on edge. A few minutes later, my boss arrived. He first saw me from head to toe and asked me if I was okay. I said yes, and explained that fortunately the police arrived just in time so that the man could not get near me. Then he assessed the damage. At some point I called my husband, explained in broad strokes what had happened, and told him that one of the officers would escort me home. He was naturally concerned, but I assured him that I was fine and that nothing bad had happened to me in the end. I took the next few days off with my boss's permission, but immediately began looking for another job, but this time during the day. When I gave my statement, the officer explained that the person might be associated with a former co-worker who had been fired a few weeks earlier for stealing and had simply disappeared. This made all the sense in the world, for this person knew when people came and went, knew where we kept the cell phones we sold, as well as the fact that many of them were not under lock and key, but under a vendor's desk, from smartphones to Blackberries when they were still worth buying, as well as VO boxes and phone cards. I left this job a month later and started at a credit card machine company, a crowded office which to this day is still a call center, but I felt much safer there, especially since there were cameras throughout the building. As I said before, this company is no longer around as it was bought out by another company, and they basically liquidated all the funds that were worth anything. So that dirty man who tried to break into my office never saw us again. If you're an IT professional, you should know that there are always new opportunities around the corner. As an IT professional who has been in the workforce for over a decade, I have been changing jobs and looking for something better every 2 to 3 years. I am constantly upgrading myself, so I'm always on the lookout for better jobs at companies that offer me the chance to grow my career. This year I applied for a job at one of the most prestigious companies in the country, and given my experience and background, I was hired almost immediately. It is always a wonderful experience to work in a new work environment with new people. However, the very moment I started in this new job, I noticed something strange. Everyone, and I mean everyone, even the cleaning and maintenance staff, leaves the office building at 5 p.m. sharp, not a minute later. It doesn't matter if there is urgent work or a pending job, or if there is some inspection or audit first thing the next day and things are not in order. The employees in full lock up their machines at 5 o'clock and leave. At first I thought they were very strict with their work hours, but as the months went on I realized there was more to the story. I tried to talk to some of my colleagues about this weird policy, but every time I did I got the same answer, that the company respects their employees' time and doesn't expect them to work off the clock or overtime. I tried to talk to my boss about it, and got a very similar response. If you have ever worked in IT or know anyone who has, you know that overtime is a big part of our profession and that almost every IT employee has worked overtime at least once in their career. Because basically, for us, the important thing is that the work is completed, not so much the time, so it was really strange to me that this company was so strict about working hours. So I decided to communicate with another employee of our company who works in a different location through LinkedIn. I asked him about why this company's strict working hours policy, but his response left me very surprised. This colleague assured me that he was completely unaware that there was such a policy in the company, since in the branch where he works, everyone works overtime without a problem, so it is not really a policy of the company itself, but rather of the branch where I was working. I know most of you must be thinking, why am I complaining about not being able to do overtime? Isn't it great to only work the hours you get paid for? It's great to work only 8 hours and then take the night for yourself. But even though the projects in this office are better than the previous ones, the employees are not really too efficient to get the work done in the 8 hours a day, and none of them do overtime. So we always have a backlog of work. Since I came to the company, there was not a single day when the work was completed satisfactorily, but all the time we had to come in the next day completing the previous day's outstanding work. And honestly, that has always been a headache for me. I hate leaving outstanding work. I'm a project manager, so one day, I finally decided to do what I had been planning for a couple of weeks. Stay late and work overtime to make sure I got to each of our upcoming projects on time. However, when I proposed this idea to my teammates, each of them was just as surprised, but not just surprised, more like scared. I didn't understand their reaction, so I ignored them completely and decided to stay late that day by myself, even though I didn't think I needed any of them to successfully complete the job. That day, like every day at exactly 5 o'clock, they all turned off their machines, packed their belongings, and left as if the devil was chasing them. I, on the other hand, stayed at my desk quietly. I had all the files I needed by my side and had asked my teammates to email me some of the resources I would need until 8 p.m. Honestly, I worked comfortably and uninterrupted for the first time since joining the company. I preferred to work like that, no matter if it was later, but that way no one was interrupting me every 10 minutes to make comments or ask me questions about ongoing projects. It was very quiet, and as I was refilling my water bottle near the fountain, I heard something fall at the back of the office where our boss's office is. I first ignored it and started walking towards my desk nonchalantly, which was at the opposite end of the room, and when I got there I heard the same noise again. But this time I was sure that something was in there knocking all the files on my boss's desk to the floor. I walked over to his office and opened the door a little to look inside, but all I saw were some files lying face down on the floor, with papers spilled all over the place. I walked into the office, put the files back in their place, and walked out. Not even a couple of seconds had passed when I heard the same noise behind me once again. The files had fallen to the floor again, and I was now convinced that there was a rodent in that office, as there was no way the files were going to fall back down on their own. I went back into the booth and checked for signs of rats or mice, but saw nothing, so I restacked the files on the desk. That's when I heard the water fountain turn off. Was there anyone else in the office? Perhaps a member of the cleaning crew? I left the booth and walked straight to the water fountain. When I arrived, it was turned off and there was no one around. "Hello, is anyone in the office?" I called out. There was no response. There was dead silence all over the place. It was very strange. I started walking towards my desk again, and then I heard it once more. The files crashed to the floor again in our boss's cabin, but with more violence. It seemed they had been thrown against the floor with a lot of force. This time, I decided to leave it at that. I kept walking towards my desk, and suddenly I felt as if someone was walking behind me. I quickly turned around and there was no one there. The lights were on, And in our office, we have motion sensors, so whenever there is movement, the lights come on, and the lights behind me came on. But I was alone in the office. All these strange occurrences started to seriously freak me out, so I decided to work one more hour and then pack up my stuff and go home. But when I got to my desk, the hallway lights flickered as if someone had just walked there. I knew for sure that there was no one but me in the office. So how the hell were all these lights coming on? Hello? Is anyone there? You're scaring me. Just let me know if there's anyone there, okay? Again, there was no response, just silence. Finally, I sat down at my desk and continued working. But before I could do anything, the water fountain went off again. Was this place haunted? Was there something supernatural going on here? I had so many questions swirling around in my mind. Normally, I didn't believe in any of this sort of thing, but at this moment, I wasn't so sure. I was on edge. So I put my head down and kept working, trying to ignore the number of disturbing events that were happening around me. However, a while later, all the lights went out in the front of the office. There were some desks there, and this time, I wanted to catch the culprit. I wanted to know who it was that was being funny and was wasting my time. I got up from my chair and saw a very familiar person sitting at one of the desks. This person had his back to me, which immediately started to make me nervous. The hair on my back began to curl down to the back of my neck as I approached the cubicle. I still wasn't sure if this was an elaborate prank or if it was real, so I cautiously walked towards this person, and when I was about a foot away from him, I put a hand on his shoulder. The man finally turned around. However, I was definitely not prepared for what was about to be revealed in front of my eyes. The person sitting in the chair who was now looking at me was myself, but with his eyes pulled out of their sockets and his mouth sewn shut with black thread. It looked like something straight out of a horror movie. I was completely terrified. My breathing began to quicken and I started walking backwards, trying to run away from whatever this other me was. I moved clumsily and hurriedly, bumping into chairs and desks along the way. I was so terrified and in shock that my voice wouldn't come out while that specter was still in the same place, just watching me as I walked away. I took the back entrance and ran out at full speed, got in my car and drove home without looking back. My wife was very worried when I arrived because I didn't have my briefcase or my cell phone, but I didn't say anything to her. I was too shocked to articulate words. The next day when I went to the office, everyone looked at me with complicity on their faces, as if they somehow knew what had happened to me, but no one said a word to me about it. The office staff simply acted as if I had never worked overtime. I too decided to sweep it under the rug and did not discuss my horrible experience with anyone. But from that day on, I too left the office at 5 o'clock like an arrow. A year later, we hired a new employee, and she also wanted to work overtime. This time, however, when she spoke about it, I had the same horrified and surprised expression on my face. I, as well as all the other employees, knew very well what was in store for her. My name is Teresa, and I work as a waitress in a bar in town. This is a job that I have had for 3.5 years, and the truth is that I really enjoy it most of the time. But I have also had some scary experiences. But there was one in particular that was not only absolutely creepy, but it changed my life completely. This happened about a year ago, and since then my life has been different. I usually work pretty late at night, around 2 or 3 a.m. One night I was very busy, as it usually is at the bar where I work every weekend. The sidewalk across the street has a lot of people passing by as well. There is a lot of traffic in this area, both vehicles and pedestrians, and it can be a bit of a chaotic environment. That day it was around 1 a.m. when I saw a man walking down the sidewalk. He stopped and looked out the window. From where I was, behind the bar, I had a pretty good view of this big window in front of us, so I was able to detail the guy. The man was wearing old sunglasses and a hat, but he seemed to be looking right at me. Seeing a person with dark sunglasses on in the middle of the night is always a striking detail because obviously you're not wearing them to protect yourself from the sun, and in this case, the same with the hat. The man had stopped and was just standing there staring out the window. I saw him and thought it was a little strange, but I kept working. I was too busy and didn't have time to think about it. As the night went on, the guy was just still there. But at one point I just stopped paying attention to him, and by the time I went back to give him a look, he was gone. But sometime later he was back and once again looking at me through the window. It was a couple of minutes when I wasn't too busy, and that's when I realized how weird this was. I just looked at him and he looked at me, but he didn't wave or anything. He was just staring at me through the window, and the truth is, I was already getting restless. The guy was standing maybe a foot away. However, after about 2 or 3 minutes straight, I saw him walk away. He didn't enter the bar at all, as far as I know, and after that he didn't come back the whole shift. I certainly didn't recognize him, but then again, he was wearing sunglasses and it was dark, so I couldn't see him very well. Plus, I probably met thousands of people during my years of bartending, so maybe it was an old customer, or so I told myself to try to put it behind me and not get paranoid. That night, when I finally finished my work around 3 a.m., I couldn't help but feel a very intense sense of unease. I lived only a few blocks away from the bar, so most of the time I used to walk, and that night was no exception. I hurried back to my apartment, walking as fast as I could, but I couldn't get the image of that man staring at me through the window out of my head. Fortunately, I never saw him again. The next day and several days after that incident, I felt a bit nervous, and every now and then I would glance at the window to make sure the guy wasn't there. I even wondered if I should change my route home, or if I should ask someone to accompany me, because the truth is that I had this kind of bad feeling, as if my subconscious was warning me to watch out for this person, even though I didn't even know who he was. Fortunately, I didn't see the man again during those days. But for some reason, that feeling of fear and vulnerability that I had never experienced before didn't leave me. A few nights later, I think a week or so had passed, I walked home as usual after shift. By now, the streets were almost completely empty, despite it being a busy city. But it was almost 4 a.m., and it was Wednesday. Usually these streets have life at all hours every day, but midweek it was slacker at night, as you would expect. It took me maybe about 10 minutes to walk from work to about halfway. I was on the sidewalk and passed an alley that I usually walk through every night, but this time as I walked through, I noticed someone standing at the bottom of the alley, about 50 feet down or so. It was certainly creepy that someone was standing in the middle of a dark alley at that hour. I looked up just on instinct, and to my horror, I realized that this was the same man who was looking at me through the bar window. I recognized him because he still had his weird sunglasses and hat on. And I should clarify that these weird glasses were not weird in a funny way. They were big and old-fashioned. But the thing about them is that they spanned half of his face. Just like at the bar, he was just standing there doing nothing but looking at me as I walked by. I picked up my pace and walked faster. I couldn't believe I was seeing him again, let alone in this dark alley. This is a big city, where a lot of people live, so I didn't think it was a coincidence that I was meeting him precisely in this place and at this time, when I usually used to pass by. I began to wonder if this man somehow knew I would be passing by, and was actually waiting for me. I kept my eyes open to see if the man would follow me out of the dark alley. I was nervous and reached for my bottle of pepper spray just to be sure. As I walked away, I noticed that he didn't come out of the alley, although I kept looking behind me and didn't see me being followed home. When I finally got home, I was really relieved. I had never felt so nervous going home before. I had done it many times in the wee hours, and nothing suspicious had ever happened. After arriving, I was really tired and stressed. I got ready for bed and then went to my room. My apartment was on the 5th floor, so it wasn't at all likely that he would come in through a window or anything, so I felt a little calmer. I turned off the lights before getting into bed and also looked out the window instinctively. It had a nice view of the city, and I stood there for a few moments taking in the night scenery. But then I looked out onto the street, and as I did so, my heart skipped a beat. The man was standing right there on the sidewalk, staring at me again, as if he knew exactly where I lived, and I was certain I would be peeking right in that window. I quickly moved away from the window and then covered it with the blinds. My heart was beating wildly and my breathing was so fast that I started to run out of breath. I didn't know how this guy knew where I lived, especially which apartment was mine. I was really scared now. After that, in the days that followed, I became completely paranoid. I told several friends and co-workers, but none of them knew who the man could be, and they were also concerned for my safety. They told me I should consider going to the police, especially if I saw him again, but I didn't, as I didn't know who he was and had no proof of his harassment. But over the next few days, I remained vigilant and no longer went home alone. But one of my co-workers accompanied me. For a while, that is, maybe about 3 or 4 weeks, nothing else happened and I didn't see the guy again, so I had simply forgotten about the whole situation. But then one night I came home from work and was getting ready for bed as usual. I was in my bathroom washing my face, when I thought I heard a noise coming from the hallway of my apartment, just outside my door. With the water running right next to my head, I couldn't hear very well, so I turned off the water in the sink and listened carefully by putting my ear close to the door, and just then, I heard the front doorknob being turned, but fortunately the door was closed. Then there was a pause of about 30 seconds, which was followed by a knock on my front door. I was completely paralyzed and in a state of panic. I hadn't seen anyone, but I knew it was the same guy. I remembered everything that had happened in the last few days, and at this hour, I didn't know who else it could be. I walked to the door very slowly and quietly. I looked through the peephole, and sure enough, it was him. He was standing right outside my door. I wondered how he had gotten into the building, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that he was now behind my door. The guy started frantically turning the handle, and I was so overwhelmed and scared that I didn't know what to do, and the only thing I could think of was to walk very quietly to my room while he tried to force the door and lock me in the closet to dial 911. Suddenly, as I stood there, I clearly heard the front door open and the sound of heavy boots began to be heard down the hallway. At that point, I was beyond panicked. I tried to keep as quiet as I could while talking to the operator. I hurriedly and almost whisperingly explained what was going on and pleaded with her to come help me. I was told that an officer would be there shortly, but this did not reassure me in the least, because this man was already inside the house. While I was on the line, I could hear the guy trying to open the door to my room. He had already managed to open the front door, so it was only a matter of time before he burst into my room. Worst of all, I was so nervous and scared that it didn't even cross my mind to start screaming for help, as silly as that sounds. I carefully walked back to my bedroom door, tiptoeing across the carpet. Then the guy sort of paused in his struggling with the handle, and I could hear his heavy breathing followed by a low, raspy, macabre laugh that seemed to come from his chest, and then he started calling my name in a very sinister way, as if he knew I was right behind the door. I took several steps backwards, trying to hold back a scream, and he began to struggle with the door again, trying to get in. I was completely terrified. I could only think of the moment when he finally opened that door and came into my room. But then I started hearing sirens coming down the street, and a few minutes later, the cops started knocking on the front door and demanding the guy to come out with his hands up. But he not only didn't do it, he was still struggling with my bedroom door trying to get in and now frantically yelling at me to open it for him, while I started yelling at him to go away and leave me alone. Suddenly, when the man did not comply, the agents opened my apartment door with a bang, possibly a strong kick, and entered. Then I heard them yelling and searching the apartment, their boots echoing down the hallway behind the door. But I did not understand what was going on, because this man was still struggling with my door, calling my name and demanding that I open it. Why didn't they catch him? That's when the door to my room burst open and 2 officers came in, pointing their guns and shouting a stop. I was completely frozen and started frantically asking them about the man behind the door. They looked at each other and told me that whoever had been in my apartment had already left, because they searched the whole place and found no one, and my apartment was quite small. There was nowhere to hide. But not only that, but a few seconds before they came in, I kept hearing the man behind the door of my room. I was completely bewildered, and so were the officers. I came out of my room and started to check the apartment myself, but indeed I saw no one. And according to the officers, the front door was locked. After a while, after questioning me and listening to the same version of events over and over again, the police officers left my house, and one of them told me that I should seek psychological help, because maybe it had all been a figment of my imagination. Maybe I had had a panic attack. I was very bewildered and in shock. That night I did not sleep at all, and the next day, when it was my turn again, I was standing at the bar serving drinks when suddenly I saw the man leaning out of the window of the bar, wearing the same clothes and wearing the same dark glasses and the same hat. I was terrified when I saw him, and that's when I called one of my companions, showed him the guy, and asked him if he had ever seen him, but his answer left me cold. Not only had my companion never seen him before, but he couldn't see him right now either. At that moment I felt my stomach sink, because I could see him clearly. He was a big guy with a hat and sunglasses, and he was only a few feet away from us. It was impossible that he couldn't see him. Now I was more terrified than ever and very puzzled. Was it a spirit? A ghost that wanted to haunt me? The answer to these questions would come a week later. After that day, I began to see the man every day, and not only at work. I also heard him again trying to open the door to my apartment. This was driving me crazy, so I decided to take the police officer at his word. Maybe I was too paranoid and was experiencing panic attacks. For this reason, I made an appointment with a well-known psychologist in town. And after a couple of sessions, I discovered that I was suffering from schizophrenia. The diagnosis was absolutely devastating for me, because like many people, I used to associate this word with madness, and my first reaction was to collapse to the floor and start crying. However, the doctor then explained everything to me and told me that by taking the right medication, I could lead a completely normal life and never have this kind of episodes again. Since then, I have been taking treatment and attending therapy regularly, and I am happy to say that the doctor was right. The man with the glasses completely disappeared from my life, and I have never gone through such an episode again until now. I had just finished my first year of college and had taken a position as a cab dispatcher at my girlfriend's cousin's cab company. For the first week and a half, I worked mostly day shifts, until the owner decided to extend the hours to 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I was a lucky employee, as I would be covering 3 of the 4 of these shifts a week. The following week, I was working alone on my first night shift. The driver was out all night looking for fares, which meant that much of the night would be just me. I wasn't uncomfortable working that shift alone, as I had worked in a 24-hour coffee shop and was used to midnight shifts. It was also Wednesday or Thursday nights, so it wasn't too busy. The best part of this job was that my boss let me use the internet to play video games on my laptop in the office. From the computer desk in the office, I could see the front door, part of the reception area, and most of the front windows, so I could keep a close eye on what was going on outside. Plus, the buzzer over the door always alerted me to a new client, so I didn't have to worry about being caught off guard if I got too deep into my game. On this particular night, I was working with a cab driver named Max. Max was a very particular guy, He was about 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighed about 300 pounds. Plus, he suffered from serious health problems, one of which made all of his movements slow and painful. He was definitely not Mr. Fitness, or the type of person who could easily defend himself or others in a risky situation. During the early morning hours, around 1:30 to 2 a.m., Max received a call to go pick up someone in town about 15 minutes away. He picked up his stuff and drove late into the night, while I headed to the office and continued playing my video game. About 15 minutes later, I caught something on the top of my laptop. My mind froze. I could hear gasps, and in the reflection of the window, and I could see someone sitting in one of the waiting chairs. I walked toward the door that connects the front room to the office. A guy with a huge rat tail like a ninja had made it into the office and was now sitting in one of the chairs with his face buried in his hands, panting heavily. He was dirty, sweaty, and sounded as if he had done it by simply running a marathon. Now it's just that he was wearing this weird rat tail style haircut. He should have warned me, but I found it more amusing than scary. A few moments passed and I finally mustered up the courage to ask him if he needed a cab. At first he didn't answer. I asked him again, and he looked up at me, then took a step back in shock. His face was scratched and covered in blood, and he had a huge gash on the top of his head. This really took me by surprise, and I immediately offered him help. He replied, "I'm fine. I don't need help. I just want to go home." I asked him if he needed a cab, and if so, where he was going. He told me he lived about 20 minutes away and wanted Max to take him home, and after that, he started getting weird. I called Dave using the radio to tell him there was a fare at the office and that I wanted a ride, and he said it would take another 10 minutes or so to get there. My hand was on the phone the whole time in case the guy made any sudden moves. Instead of going back to the office, I decided it was better to stay outside where there are 2 large windows that make it easy to see what is going on inside the cab office. I didn't feel he was a threat at all, but he seemed really angry about something, so I wanted to make sure that if something happened to me, I would be able to see it. So I walked out and into the front room. When I approached the gentleman, that's when I saw that he was not only bleeding from his head but from his shoulder and knee. I asked him again if he was okay and then offered to call him an ambulance. Bad idea. "You don't need to do that," he told me. "It's not like I killed anyone, right? I never killed anyone. Don't do that. You don't need to call anyone. I just want to go home." I said, "I'm sorry. I just noticed you're bleeding pretty bad and I thought maybe you'd like someone to make sure you're okay." To which he replied by repeating, "I didn't kill anyone. You should have kept your mouth shut. You had what was coming to you. You shouldn't have said those things. But it's not like I didn't kill anyone. You don't need to call anyone. I just want to go home." "Okay," I said, "but you're bleeding." Then the man said again, "It's not like I killed anyone. I swear I didn't kill anyone. Please don't call the police. I don't need the police. I just need to go home. I didn't kill anyone." I was silent for a few minutes, completely baffled by the man's insistence that I hadn't killed anyone, when I was just talking to him about calling an ambulance. At one point, the man notices the phone in my hand and says, "I fell. I fell," he repeated. "That's why I'm bleeding. I fell. It's not like I killed anyone." Suddenly, he got up and started walking. He was getting more and more impatient for his cab, and I was afraid that there was now blood on the chair and the floor. I was still holding the phone and a little nervous, as every now and then the guy would break the silence with a string of incoherent babble about how he hadn't done anything wrong because he hadn't killed anyone, and that I didn't need to call the police because he was a good guy. Finally, Max radios me that he's about 2 minutes away, and I sigh in relief. He pulls up in front, the man gets in the car, and they drive off. Now I'm worried about Max, so I called the police and reported what happened, and they followed the cab to this guy's house where they arrested him. Turns out this guy had escaped from a nearby bar after physically assaulting a fellow patrolman. I didn't get the details in depth, but I found out that he hurt him with a sharp object. I'm guessing a pocket knife or a razor. But he ran off and fell down some sort of ravine near the place. However, he managed to get up and made his way to the cab office. During his stay at the office, the police had been looking for him, so technically no, he did not kill anyone, but he did assault and attempt to murder someone. I also found out that one of the other drivers, Steven, knew the guy from high school years ago. His name is Luke, and he belonged to a gang, which explains the rat tail. But he also had a long history of violence, including coming home drunk and snapping at his wife from time to time. Whether he had planned to do that very night, I couldn't say. But I'm glad the guy ended up behind bars, as thankfully his wife was unharmed and the guy who got stabbed apparently didn't die. At least I guess not, as I still see Luke from time to time walking the streets with his glorious rat tail. Which means he wasn't convicted, but in all seriousness, I'd love to be able to show you how extravagant his rat tail was. That thing was very impressive.